Welcome to episode 5 of the second season of the Books of My Life podcast. I'm your host, Hareth Al Bustani, Arts and Culture Editor at The National. In this podcast, I explore the roles that books and stories have played in the lives of a number of influential figures, spanning a range of backgrounds. But before we start, make sure to subscribe and follow Books of My Life on your favorite podcast app to get all the new episodes as soon as they come out. Shahd Alshammari has a profound relationship with literature. After all, she credits it with saving her life. And yet, one can imagine she saved many more through her own work. Diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at a young age, she's overcome great physical and mental obstacles to become a beacon of inspiration through extensive writings on disability and gender in the Arabian Gulf. Her memoir, Head Above Water, shines a light on the rarely heard non-Western narratives exploring illness, and she brings a crucial female Arab voice to the conversation. When we met, she discussed how the classics in Arabic literature drove a passion for life and a recognition of the power of taking the road less taken. We also discussed the importance of starting conversations around depression at a time and place where there's still so much stigma around mental health, as well as the need for more representation of people living with disabilities in film, TV, and literature. Most importantly, however, what became clear was just how important it is for people to simply listen to those telling their stories. Because we all have stories to tell, and it is precisely through those stories that we feel seen and heard. Correct me if I'm wrong, the name of one of your sessions is How Literature Saved My Life?
Yeah, absolutely.
And at the risk of asking too simple a question, how did literature save your life?
Yeah, actually, it's a really big question. So I'm an assistant professor of literature. I teach literature. But I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, MS, at the age of 18, which is a very, very young age. And at that time, I was told by a lot of doctors, not to study, not to work too hard. And I felt completely, alone and devastated. And at the time, I just kind of went to literature and books. I started just, reading. I started searching for, poetry about illness, novels that featured, people, who were struggling with some sort of mental or physical illnesses. And the more I read, the more I kind of felt less alone. And so I made a career out of it. I ended up doing, my master's and my PhD in English literature, graduating, with a PhD at the age of 28, very, very young. And I was kind of like on a mission to just stay alive more than anything. And so we called the session How Literature Saved My Life, because I was going to talk about how literature can save all of our lives, not just mine, but how, the more you read, the less you feel alone.
And what were some of the works that stand out the most during that period in terms of the novels or the poems or the collections that most resonated with you at that time?
So I read pretty much all the classics. I read Jane Austen. I read the Bronte sisters. But I also read a lot of Arabic literature at the time too. So I read a lot of Mahmoud Darwish, who is a Palestinian poet. And, the more he talked about, love for the nation and the sense of confidence and, this rejection of despair, constantly feeling like there's a reason to keep fighting, to stay alive. And the common theme was always, how do I stay alive? And most of these writers, there's also Robert Frost, American poet. One of his really, really famous poems is called The Road Not Taken. And in the poem, he just says, what kind of person would I be if I didn't take the road that was less taken? The road that a lot of people would kind of shy away from. In that poem, he says, I took the road less taken, and that has made all the difference. And the more I heard that poem, I read it, I heard it, I kept realizing that, sometimes you will end up taking the road less taken, and it does make a huge difference in your life. So, for example, you get diagnosed with an illness, or one of your parents or loved ones dies very early on in your life, and it really completely transforms you. It's not maybe the common experience for a lot of, young people, but it is the experience that changes your life. And for me, I realized that a different experience didn't have to be the end of the world. Although the majority of medical doctors, of older individuals in society, different generations, people just kind of wanted to shy away from illness, and there was a sense of despair more than anything. And again, that's where literature comes in.
Well, the beautiful thing about your story is that there's almost this alchemy of transmuting, like you say, this despair
Yeah.
into something that everyone around you, everyone familiar with your work, finds very uplifting, um, through, like you say, that the road that's less traveled.
Yeah. Yeah.
And is that something that you try to bring to literature yourself?
I think so. I mean, I also don't want to kind of push this very, very positive, upbeat approach, because a lot of people will tell you I do live with depression. I live with severe depression. Meds don't seem to be working. I've tried yoga. I've tried everything. So a lot of people have different approaches to how they handle, like the despair, like you say, or how they handle these difficult life experiences. What I am trying to do is just again start a conversation. There's so much silence around depression, around mental health, around disability, especially in this part of the world, in the Arab world in general, even more so in the GCC. And so I live in Kuwait, but I'm also quite connected to a lot of scholars and students in the GCC, and they usually say the same thing. Our students or young people will struggle to tell you, "Hey, I live with severe depression. I can't meet your deadline. I can't seem to get out of bed." There's so much shame around that. And what I'm hoping my work will do is just kind of destigmatize or begin to move away from complete shame to at least let's just talk about it. You don't have to embrace it completely and persevere and be uplifting, but at least sort of come to an acceptance that this is part of the human experience, whether you're a man, a woman, old or young, it affects everybody, especially illness, whether you get ill by age or you get COVID and you get long COVID, which now everybody's talking about. It's just part of the human experience. So why the shame? Why the hush hush around it?
There's so many interesting points you
Yeah.
made there. I mean, one of the things that really struck me was when you are going through difficulties, sometimes the last thing you want is this one of these
Happy.
uplifting, this is my great,
Yeah.
my life was awful and I was dealing with all this and now suddenly everything's perfect and it's just about being positive. But when sometimes
Yeah.
you just need the whole spectrum of things
Absolutely.
and you need some a reference that's real.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
but at the same time, like you say, especially in this region, there is this stigma around it.
Yeah.
The stigma around the world, actually,
Absolutely. Yeah.
in terms of people not feeling comfortable talking about mental
Yeah.
illness or mental health. But even more so in this region, like you say, there's that shame.
Shame. Yeah.
And it seems to be something that hasn't really changed a great deal.
Absolutely.
Do you think things are changing, or and what do you think is the key to actually being able to?
To change,
Yeah,
at least start the conversation. So I'm quite active on social media, and I see a lot of younger people. So the younger generation, 20s, and so on. There's a lot of social media awareness now when it comes to mental health specifically. So you see a lot of social media posts. You see things like these are my boundaries, a term that we never actually used to even mention. There's a lot of talk about I will have good days, but I also have bad days, but this is still me. So I think we're starting to look at mental health as complex, not so much the physical body. So we're kind of starting to talk about mental health and mental illness, but we're not really talking about the physical body, whether it's male or female. We're still kind of shying away from the body, but there is a bit more confidence when it comes to talking about mental health, at least on social media. Invisible disability is not a thing yet. People still don't talk about it. And like you said, it's everywhere in the world, actually. I lived in the UK for quite a while, and it was very similar in terms of how people responded to invisible disabilities. There's always a sense of, well, if I can't see it and you're not on a wheelchair, then it's not real. And if you say, I live with MS or I live with epilepsy or Parkinson's or all these different visible diseases, people will still want you to prove it somehow. I think it's just bizarre that, you know, humanity is still really limited when it comes to how we envision the body. We kind of approach older people with a sense of more empathy and understanding, but you see somebody young on a wheelchair, or you see somebody young who's struggling, like holding a cane or something, and then people get really uncomfortable and awkward. But with with looking at older people, there's a sense of almost, awareness or acceptance that that's part of age. So I think there's a bit of a change. I can see it on at least with the younger generation. And like I said, I still teach at university, and I see that they're more comfortable saying things like, "This is bad for my mental health," or "I live with social anxiety." But if one of them, let's say, has epilepsy, they will struggle to tell you that they might have an episode in class, and then they just don't tell you, and you're just surprised with it. So I think the body is still something we're ashamed of. The mind, we're getting there. We're starting to talk about the mind.
And where do you think that stems from? When you talk about the physical side of it or the body side of it, where do you think that stems from? Where do you think that's rooted in?
I think there's a lot of mental health campaigns all over. We in Kuwait, we've got a lot of mental health campaigns, a lot of awareness. There's a lot of advertisements now on TV and on social media about depression, what it looks like. It can look like somebody who's functional, but on other days, non-functional. So I think especially the medical community is now trying to raise awareness about mental health. School counselors are trying to raise awareness about mental health, teachers also. But again, the body is something even more marginalized. Invisible disability is, I would say, I mean, not sure about the stats, but I think it's more either undocumented, unreported, or just, less people are living with invisible disability. So I think the conversation still needs to be pushed, even on television and advertisements. So you do see some movies, some Hollywood movies. You see some Khaliji television musalsals, television series that actually have a character living with some sort of mental health issue. But you don't see, many people on wheelchairs. You don't see many people living with epilepsy, like as a character on television. And again, because you don't see it, we're still not talking about it.
And are there cases where, when you do see characters who are living with epilepsy or anything, do you find there are cases where, I mean, are they typecast in certain roles, or is that written around their character, or
Yeah.
is that just kind of incidental to who they
It's
are?
usually actually, I think it's usually a very stereotypical, like you say, it's a very stereotypical image. So, for example, most female characters on television, if they are, in a wheelchair, if you see them, and it's very rare, then she will be left behind somehow, or have this tragic love story, or also incidentally is suicidal because of the disability, and it seems to overlap somehow. So it's a very tragic view. So sometimes, I wonder whether, just actually having representation on screen is important, or whether it's the right kind of representation. It can be really, really stigmatizing. So you get a lot of people seeing that on television, like gathering around for a Ramadan musalsal, and then what they see is something really, really tragic, and that just scares people even more from even talking about illness. And again, it kind of just further reinforces this idea of this is shameful. This is tragic. Nobody's going to love you. You're not going to get a job. You're not going to get, kind of integrated into society. So yeah, I think there's a lot more left to do, especially with writers and screenwriters, not just authors, but screenwriters and for television and so on.
It's a really good point, actually, and it's actually very international. I'm aware that there's a lot of Japanese and Korean TV shows,
Yeah,
dramas, where the focal point is always a relationship where one person has an illness and
yeah,
the other one doesn't, and the illness is a plot device.
yeah, absolutely.
And like you say, that must be very
Yeah, it
stigmatizing.
can be very, very alienating and depressing. I know, a lot of women who live with disability, and, when they see the stuff on television, it just further, depresses you, and you feel like even more outcasted, because the representation is one that makes you kind of sure that this is going to happen to you too, which is really, really hard to live with. Which gets us kind of back to how literature saves your life. It can also really, really destroy you. So, whatever you end up reading and whatever you end up watching really, really does have, I think, this really, really huge influence.
Do you think there's any books that do a really good job of integrating characters with either physical illness or mental health issues or any invisible disabilities? I think
Yeah,
these.
absolutely. I think, I'm noticing that with young adult literature, you see more of this. So, John Green has a few books that deal with mental health and anxiety. And I think Perks of Being a Wallflower,
Yeah.
that's one of the really good ones. It really looks at anxiety and depression as not this death statement, but that, there are ups and downs, and you have days where you can kind of function and be part of society, and days where you just can't. I think still that there's a lot of young adult literature that's kind of moving forward and embracing the idea that you can have a protagonist with a disability. But in terms of adult literature, I think we're still kind of waiting for that. I haven't seen anything recently that's a bit uplifting, unless it's a memoir. With memoir, you get to see a bit more realistic, storytelling in a way.
Do you find there's something about the nature of storytelling where writers tend to go to kind of the simple extremes? For example, if they deal with topics of addiction, it's always kind of the most extreme, kind of
Yeah.
stereotypical, cartoony kind of version of addiction. If it's dealing with depression, it's always a very kind of, there's not a nuanced depiction, but it's because I think writers maybe think that that's how they have. Do you think
Yeah.
that writers feel like they have to approach it in that way? And how do you see that changing?
Well, I think that's also really influenced by what the media wants and what Hollywood wants. And again, like I'm thinking of all of these blockbuster movies that were originally books. There's Me Before You. That became like a bestseller, a young adult movie, and the guy's in a wheelchair, and manages to find love, but also tragically doesn't want to survive. So it looks at what it means to be alive with a disability. Is that a life worth living? So it is quite extreme, and it really sold. It sold. It became a blockbuster and a bestseller. Um, the writing is great. Not saying that the writing isn't great, but I think also there's a sense that the audience does want to see something that not only is tragic, but it also kind of makes you feel like, well, I'm sort of glad that's not me. There's a
Mm,
sense of, there's a sense of relief, and also the sense of empathy. I feel for you, but I'm also glad that that's not me. There's this kind of distance. And these things tend to really sell more than something that's just like a very blah narrative where, I live with this, but, I'm also an average person. I think the market wants to see things that are either really inspirational or really, really tragic. And both ways, I think, they do a lot of injustice to people who are actually living with illness and disability. They're marketed as either heroes or as these tragic villains. So I think with a bit more awareness that writers can develop. So read more about disability, read more about illness before you decide to write about a character who lives with illness, and trying just to kind of make them into this plot device, like you said.
are there any resources that you would kind of point to a writer to as a frame of reference?
So there's a lot of stuff online actually. If you just type in how to write a character with disability, as simple as that, you'll find that a lot of writers with disabilities actually have posted lots of blog posts and lots of like how-to manuals, and what stereotypes to avoid. It's just like if a male author decides to have a female protagonist, what things to avoid. How can I still write this in a very authentic manner without being very, very stereotypical? So I would always say talk to people before you start, writing something that's in your head without actually, asking either, a woman living in a woman's body or, somebody with a disability living in a disabled body. I find that if I talk to a lot of people, different races, different genders, different abilities, as a writer, I feel more authentic. I feel like I'm kind of able to think about, did I get that right or did I sell that? Because, publishers want to see that and readers want to see that. So at the end of the day, I think it has a lot to do with author integrity and, trying to find that balance between really, really selling and also being authentic.
And also, I think probably a different approach to writing where you push yourself actually out a little bit more instead of leaning into the more like kind of obvious
Yeah.
air quotes kind
Yeah.
of plot device,
Yeah.
creating more nuance in that
Absolutely.
process as well.
Yeah, which is a much harder job, but I think I have this view that if you're a writer, then you need to be willing to read about all sorts of experiences, and also be willing to talk to lots and lots of people.
And what is the one thing that you hope people will take away from your work?
So the book Head Above Water, the title itself actually says head above water. So we're not constantly, swimming. We're not constantly drowning either. And that's the human experience. You're not going to have all good days and you're not always going to be happy and inspirational, but you're not always going to be feeling like you're drowning either. So for me, that's what I want the book to be about, kind of embrace this complexity of living in any body, not just the disabled body, but any body or any mind. Again, I'm hoping that people will start thinking about invisible disabilities. People will start also accepting that it can happen to anyone. It's not something that you just, can avoid forever. So we might get sick but just by age, or you might develop something just out of the blue, or you might get into a car crash, God forbid. So there's all sorts of things that can happen to us. And if that happens, how do I keep my head above water? That's what I'm hoping people will start reflecting on. And I'm not sort of giving this full on clear answer, but I'm just kind of, raising questions about how do we survive?
How important is it for people to just listen to other people's experiences?
Well, I love you for that question. It's such a great question. Most of the time, I've found that people don't just listen. Even not just readers, interviewers, people who ask you questions. The first question is, can you prove that this is in fact hard, or how do we know that this is actually real? There's a sense of disbelief more than anything. And I think if we just kind of lend an ear, if we just listen, we need to kind of start listening with a bit more of an open heart and just accepting that just because this is not my experience doesn't mean that your experience is, invalid, or it hasn't actually happened, or it's not as severe as you say. So I think we tend to disbelieve quite a lot. And I see this again on social media and I see it everywhere. I think that's what we really need. We need to start listening a bit more to different experiences if we're ever gonna get anywhere as not just men and women and Arabs and non-Arabs and Muslims and non-Muslims and people with disabilities and people without disabilities. But there needs to be this sort of conversation happening. And before the attack or before the questions being asked, you just kind of really need to listen. I hope people will listen.
That brings us to the end of this episode of Books of My Life Season 2. I hope you found it as insightful as I did. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this, make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anghami, or your favorite podcasting platform. Next week, I sit down with comedian, actor, and children's author Ben Miller. Stay tuned for more captivating conversations and gripping stories. This episode was produced by Arthur Edison and Dua Farid. I'm your host, Hareth Al Bustani. Thanks for listening.